our next presenters, Kamal, Badreshany, Michel de Vreeze, and Graham Phillip of Durham University, to speak about the development of integrated regional economies in the early Bronze Age Levant, new evidence from Combed-Ware jars. Kamal, hello, the stage is yours.
Sure. I've lost my presentation though. Let me just see if I can find it. Oh, okay, here it is in the back. So can everyone hear okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
and
yeah. Well, thank you, Yael and Mark and Yuri for developing this session and inviting us to speak. It's really great. You'll notice to comment really quickly that we've changed the title of our presentation slightly, and that's because in the last 2 years since we submitted it, we've learned a lot more about the development of ceramic traditions. But more importantly, we now understand the region of that we're going to be talking about today in Lebanon and in the Byblos region is characterized by a marked regionalism. So to apply any lessons that we learn or any takeaways to the entirety of the Levant may not necessarily be valid. So today we'll be discussing early Bronze Age urbanism and regionalism, but through the lens of the ceramic data. I think, we're all pretty much agreed that, the sort of nucleation of settlements during the EB2 emerges in the central and southern Levant around 3050 BC, maybe a little bit later in some places. I guess I could safely say that we're not entirely clear why the situation changes from what comes before it. But I would say it's mostly been explained as a long-term process of social and technological innovation, leading to population growth and then, the need for administrative complexity to manage it. However, the early Bronze Age 2 and all the trappings of it arrives quite suddenly on the Lebanese coast, and this sort of suggests or argues against a long-term developmental process. I mean, even within Lebanon, there are, different regions. And for example, there's evidence that the Bekaa has more of a traditional development with an EB1, EB1B like Palestine. But on the coast, we see no clear evidence of that. So the social conditions which underpin settlement nucleation are often variable and can only be understood as such. So if we really try to apply a one-size-fits-all explanation to Levantine urbanism, I think we will fail. So there are shared concepts, shared bits of architecture, shared bits of material culture, but we're, as is good for this workshop, we'll see that there are distinct regional trajectories. So I don't think I have to tell anyone in this workshop that ceramics are a major part of the surviving archaeological record. So, we should think of new ways and within which to use them and to mobilize this very important data resource. However, I do want to make it clear that, we understand in this context, in the context of the early Bronze Age 2, 3 on the Lebanese coast, they're imbued with social meaning and they're economically significant. I mean, we'll argue here throughout this presentation that they're absolutely the hardware of early states, and they sort of enable them to do whatever it is they're doing. We've also argued that they carry a clearly identifiable brand, and in fact, they themselves represent a key technology which perhaps enables the development of this intensively settled landscape. So while they may have a domestic function and domestic capacity in this region, it's quite hard to decouple them fully from this role and the way in which they're identified with their administrative function. However, the good news is we can use them to gain nuance about aspects of early states, which is the type of research we've been engaged with more recently. So there are broad similarities in what I would call, the central Levant, which probably includes parts of northern Palestine, but the developmental trajectory varies from region to region. So there are some differences when we're talking about the Lebanese coastal context. There's similar developmental phases that we would see in Palestine in the EB2 and 3. Obviously a great expansion of settlement and then major building at those settlements. However, the settlements are relatively small, maybe suggesting a low population. The biggest ones are 4 or 5 hectares or so. Here's a satellite photo of Tel Farouz on the northern Lebanese coast. And then, it's size superimposed in my neighborhood here in Britain. You can see it's tiny. It's something like 1 hectare or 1.5 hectares, yet it still has a 6-meter thick defensive wall. My understanding is the average size in Palestine of sites is much bigger, between 4 and 12 hectares, and then with some much bigger ones occurring, though I imagine there must be regions that offer also similarly small sites. Speaking of the Lebanese context, the level of knowledge is quite varied. The settlement landscape of the Bekaa, for example, is very well understood, but the excavations and stratigraphic sequences are almost non-existent. The Akkar also has had a lot of surveys done. We will focus on this cluster of settlements outlined in the green dotted line here, Byblos, Fadus, Kfar Abida, and Kubatu, because it's an area where we have, pretty solid survey. We have a lot of good sequences, and so we can start to draw together some of this data. Of course, we'll bring in some data from Sidon and Arka, and considering the interesting things we heard about Tyre as well. Again, the developments in Lebanon are broadly in line with this distinctive core of what is metallic ware early, and then becomes a kind of broad Combed-Ware tradition. But there are some peculiarities in the ceramic material and in the architecture. Like little things. So for example, like for some reason in Lebanon they love to put these column bases in corners in ways that I've not seen really anywhere else. They have these these houses where you enter in on the second floor. Most of the evidence is scant, but mostly we see building in mud brick. Sidon and in places like Arka, but the Byblos region seems to build in stone. Now, thanks to some recent work at Kuba and at Fadus, Kfar Abida, and at Byblos, and at Arka and in Sidon, we can now start to think about a more concrete evidence for phasing. So we've divided the early Bronze Age into 4 broad phases based on the architecture. The first thing to say is that we don't really understand the Chalcolithic EB. It's mostly represented by burials, and we don't have any radiometric evidence for any date beyond 3500 BC, though I'll discuss a very specific example. So the EB2 seems to come out of nowhere, and at first it gets going quite slowly with relatively small scale building. And it's only after 2900 BC that we see most of the sites we'll be talking about as occupied, and with massive building taking place in the EB3 and later. So to start at the Chalcolithic EB, here's the site of Byblos, one which you probably all know well. And just to say that all of the main EB sites that are occupied, or the principal sites, show evidence of occupation in the Chalcolithic, and apparently even Tyre now. So it's worth considering whether or not the location of sites is independent of the concerns of the early Bronze Age. There must be some other reason that historically they were important and the focus of settlement. Byblos is the key site of this period. It's mostly represented by burials. You can see all these gray dots indicate a burial. And there are some dwellings, but the relationship really is unclear. I want to show you what the pottery looks like, because it really carries on a Chalcolithic tradition. I mean, we can build plates of this stuff, but it's really quite difficult because it's quite varied and all over the place. The material, when you pick it up, is quite coarse. It's very distinct and definitely very different from what occurs in the early Bronze Age too. And there's some petrographic evidence that shows it's locally made using very local clays and things that occur around the site. Again, the date is uncertain, but we'll talk about that in more detail in a second. But the material really carries on this Chalcolithic tradition, and I'm not entirely sure there are clear parallels with EB1B Palestine, though some of the things Yael said in her presentation makes me think we should maybe revisit this in a bit more detail. And likewise, at Sidon, it's quite similar to Byblos, but you don't have the variety of forms. I mean, most of the ceramics, a lot of the ceramics were put in burials in Byblos, so there are many different ritual type forms. Here we just had these bowls, but again, they're a coarse fabric. So here we see the proto-urban phase at Byblos, and there are 2 main takeaways from this slide. The first is, in this building here, in this room in this building, we found in situ on the floor a very clear EB2 assemblage of so-called metallic ware, an early EB2 assemblage. So it makes you think that this really, what we're looking at here is mostly EB2. However, Dunon himself was convinced that there was an overlap between the Neolithic material and the EB2 material. And he actually says that there is a floor, and we don't know where, we're trying to figure this out, but it's somewhere around here, where the EB2 material exists in situ with the Chalcolithic material or the Neolithic material. And the reason we bring this up is, Yael, you might recognize this quote, but again, it's similar to the types of overlaps between EB2 and EB1B materials that we see further south. I mean, we're going to take Denon at face value here. We all know the problems with the excavation at Byblos, but I mean, we think he would have been able to recognize, in situ floor deposits. So it's possible then that the underlying structures that would develop in the EB2-3 system are already in place during the Chalco EB1 in Lebanon. And it's just that this hardware is easily accepted because of the underlying system exists there. And it's a new way, in utilizing this new ceramic hardware is a new way of managing it and then intensifying this system. The early pottery, as you've heard, is mostly made of this kind of shale ware. We can call it metallic or whatever we want, but the key thing is it's a new technology, and it's an interesting way of making pottery that's only really known from the early Bronze Age in the region. And the thing that we don't talk about a lot are the cooking pots, which actually there's no real precursor to them either. I mean, there's nothing we can identify as a clear cooking pot form from the earlier material. So a new type of cooking pot comes in. However, these are calcite tempered, though they're introduced with the metallic ware tradition. Talking about this shale pottery, it comes in two sort of main variants, and there might be a third one I'm adding soon when I look at the very earliest material, but you've got the sort of bog standard, and then later on, about 2900 and after, you get this stuff with a silty kind of quartz in it. And this is really important because all of the known examples of seal impressed vessels are made in this ware. So for example, here's the seal impressed vessel from Arca, the only one of its type, and it's the only vessel found in this specific fabric. So it's quite a labor intensive thing. I think they're crushing the quartz quite heavily, and it's used for the very, very best pottery. But anyway, shale wares in general are found in this this intensive zone of distribution, or this is where it's intensely distributed. We've analyzed the geochemically via ICAANE, the silty shale vessels, and we find that they match each other quite closely in terms of their chemistry, despite coming from a number of regions: Lebanese coast, northern Jordan, Jordan Valley, and it suggests to us that they're from a related production, or belong to a shared community of practice, and probably share a very similar chronology. During this early period, the principal sites are occupied, namely Byblos and Arca. We do have an occupation from the site of Kubba 1. But it's pits, there's no known settlement. Here you can see the one radiometric date we have from the site, and you can see it fits right in line with some of the earliest dates. The typology is quite simple here. We have some jars, and the platter bowls are quite common. And just to show you, up top here are the cooking pots, which, as far as we can tell, it's hard to tell, but have rounded bases rather than flat ones in most cases. And we get these sort of flaring and rolled rims. And you can see here when we go to Kubba 2, which is a site just 500 meters away from the original Kubba 1, it's almost like they're flattening the rims and creating what will become the typical kind of whole mouth shape of the EB3, which is often pattern combed. And here, this figure is adapted from Greenberg in 2006, and we can see that this flaring rim, sort of belongs to this northern tradition, from including Tel Dan. And really, these are the places that, in my mind, in the early Bronze Age too, really have quite a lot of shale ware, where it really makes up 80–90% of the assemblage, that sort of thing. But the key part is the cooking pots should be seen as an important part of the EB2 ceramic package. Okay, so for whatever reason and whatever their significance is, they come along with it. During the EB2-3 transition, there's a major expansion of settlement. Just to go through this, I mean, we can date this phase based on the presence of this silty shale, but the key thing is that there's an overlap in forms. There's a gradual transition to localized production, and we're starting to see more of the non-shale calcareous wares come in. So Kubba 1 is abandoned in favor of Kubba 2, and you can just see a quick look at the different types that come in. And here notice the seal impressed jar, but we see a gradual replacement of forms from shale into the local calcareous materials. The EB3 is just like in the South. There's major building proliferation of settlements, including planned layouts, substantial buildings, and huge fortifications. And the repertoire changes in terms of the ceramics slightly, and there's a move towards the calcareous fabrics on the coast. And platter bowls disappear, and there is an increase in combing. It's worth saying that it occurs earlier, though it's not as common as it is later. This coincides with major building phases of the early Bronze Age 3, as I've already said, and the same fabric is really used up and down the coast. I mean, as far as we can tell, minor variations at Sidon, but from Byblos to Arca, it's indistinguishable under the microscope. And what we have is evidence of a kind of centralized production, and then what we've termed is the local capture of ceramic production. So we think as ceramics are becoming more and more important to the political economy, there's a greater demand for these, and there's a greater need to ensure that there's the supply. And then there's maintenance of local specialists. Whereas before, in a bid to explain how the shaleware occurs everywhere at once, we've posited a mode of itinerant potters. However, not everybody agrees with this. So the platter bowls disappear during the EB3, and it's a key thing because we've just heard that they exist in Palestine. So that's one key difference. They disappear, we think, in favor of drinking paraphernalia. They may still exist in the Bekaa. And what it shows is that they and the activity that they represent may never have fully entrenched on the Lebanese coast as it did further south. So they sort of fall out of usage. What about the combing, which becomes much more common starting in the EB3? Here we're going to show you a video by Mary Watson, a video made by Mary Watson, experimental potter from Sunderland, and she is making a Combed-Ware jar. Here you can see the finished product at the bottom. She's actually just making a regular jar, but according to her, the easiest way to join the coils is to comb them together. So, Jean-Paul Tellman and Karine Sawada suggested that the combing was an important part of the chaîne opératoire, but to actually finish the vessel and to burnish it is an extra step, and actually takes quite a lot of time. So we can see combing as beginning as an efficiency. They're actually skipping the step of finishing the vessel and just churning these things out. However, later it becomes a decoration and a brand in its own right with its with the pattern combing. And here are some of the EB3 vessels from Kubba, just to show you what they look like. Again, a lot of jar forms, these big vats coming in. We found 4 large vats at Kubba. Here's one of them reconstructed for you, reconstructed by Hashim. And here they were found in situ. So obviously more than just local production. I mean, we're seeing a large use of them. We don't know what they're for, but we strongly suspect they're used in the production of olive oil or the. And here's again the ICP data from the Byblos area, and what it shows is that between Byblos and Kubba and Farouz Kfar Abida, there's a lot of overlap in the chemistry, which suggests they're sharing production sources and they're probably trading the vessels intensively. However, if you go further north to the Arca area, there's very little overlap between the two, and that shows that there's not really direct trade in whatever those jars hold. That's probably pretty sensible because I think it's. Whatever they hold is probably something very readily available to the people at Arca. I won't talk too much about the Giza stuff for the lack of time. However, we interpret this as being a specialized production made in the Byblos area, and you'll have to take my word for it, but there's good evidence for it. During the EB4, many sites are abandoned, or more likely that their size is reduced or they're settled periodically. Combed-Ware jars disappear from everywhere except for Arca and the Syrian coast. As far as we can tell, the Syrian tradition continues to flourish. At Arca, they become quite a bit different, and they develop this very horizontal combing, and I think they're being made more on the wheel. In the area of Byblos, it seems like pottery is not necessarily being produced on a large scale there. So I've seen a few vessels petrographically, and it represents a real technological break. I mean, this is a question we still have to investigate in more detail. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. The area is known for high levels of olive production, grape, and emmer wheat. So, for example, here's Farouz, and it's really quite a lot of olive, more than you would need. And then they also manage their own animals, and it's mostly sheep and goat. So it seems like basically there's pretty good evidence that the olives and the grapes have something to do with what they're putting in the jars. So putting the pieces together. We have the sudden adoption of elements of a new urban package on previously occupied sites in most cases, though there's not necessarily continuity or a clear development. The sites are very small, so it seems like they have the core function of whatever it is they're doing in the early Bronze Age, but not necessarily anything else. The main building only occurs after 2900 BC, with a serious rebuilding after 2800 or 2700. The settlements are planned. However, and I didn't show this for lack of time, but they're dominated by ritual and elite contexts or administrative contexts, so as far as we can tell. There's a great increase in pottery production, especially during the EB3, but starting in the EB2 to facilitate olive oil and wine production. We think evidence of move towards a local capture at all of these sites during the EB3, or in all of these regions, rather. The sites, we think they mediate production and perhaps redistribution. And, there's little evidence, as has been said by others, for high status objects. I mean, they exist, but it's more of a culture of uniformity and kind of simplicity. That doesn't change in Lebanon. So the external trade is limited to a few key sites, Byblos being one of them. And there's if this system of Combed-Ware jars represents, it underpins the economy and is the main component of the economy, its disappearance must be interpreted as a decline in the system at all sites, or at least a drastic economic shift. So rather than talk about conclusions, I thought I could ask some questions for the discussion session. So the question is, we can show that the area of Byblos has a distinct architectural and ceramic regionalism, but how to interpret it? How do we interpret it? The EB is linked by infrastructures and elements of material culture, broad social concepts, but it's clear there are varied pathways and manifestations to complexity. So how do these slight differences translate into notions of identity? What does it mean to be from the area of Byblos? And would somebody identify you as such, or would they identify as such? How do we explain the rapid adoption of this new package? I mean, is there an underlying long-term economic development that isn't necessarily manifested in ceramics in a way that we can identify in the Lebanese context? And if the ceramics and settlement data, represent the administration of a communal system of agriculture, how does that play into all of this? And the key thing is, how does the economy function? And that's something I think we've not really discussed. I mean, there's been some suggestion at a straight up market economy, but I'm not sure I see evidence for that. Is there some sort of socially embedded redistribution, some combination of the both? And then the last thing is, how widespread is participation? Are important segments of society really invisible here? I mean, how much? And remember, these sites are really tiny, yet they're building huge walls and things like that. So that there must be an invisible population that we can't see, and it may not be so drastic if you go further south where they have bigger sites. But it's something we really need to think about and investigate. All right, thanks very much. And here's just some acknowledgments. Thank you to everyone on the list.
Thank you very much, Kamal, for this.
Glad you're still here.
I'm still here.
Yeah, well, it's more like you can't tell if people can hear you or see you or not. Okay.
Yeah, we saw you very well and heard you very well. And
Yeah.
thank you for this stimulating presentation. Let me go to Ibrida now and see if there are any questions from the crowd. Meredith Chesson wishes to thank you for this fascinating talk, Kamal, and she thanks everybody, and I assume she's going to sleep at this point. Any other questions from the audience? While we wait for questions, I just wanted to comment that column bases along the walls are something that we do have, at least in the EB1 in the southern Levant. I remember we had this phenomenon at Bet-Shan, but not necessarily on the corners, but we do have column bases along the walls.
Yeah. But in EB2 as well. Not that it matters much, but I mean, I'm not surprised to hear this, I have to say, but it just seemed to be something that we've never, as a community of scholars working in Lebanon, have never found a clear parallel for. It might be a little thing, but it's one way you can kind of just say, like, this is something they do slightly different, and maybe the house looks different or something. But it's good to know.
Let's see. Maria Luciani asks if ceramic equal hardware equal brand equal identity. Not sure I understand the questions, but can you comment on that?
Yes, is the answer. I mean, I don't know what she wants me to say. It's I know that it's hard to move away from thinking about ceramics as a very a daily use object or something that's quotidian in its nature, but here, I mean, the forms and where they're found, in the context really shows that they're associated with a very specific form of very specific form of economy. And that's not to say that that's everywhere. What we're talking about is a very specific cluster of sites in Byblos. If you go north to Tel Arqa, you have more what you'd expect. But my question is, can you, given that they're so clearly associated with these main sites and with that system, is it possible in this context to completely decouple them, where you just have this sort of domestic system? And that's the question. And how does it differ? I mean, in further south, it's clearly very different.
Okay, let's move forward to another question. Uri Davidovich asks, why do they change from shale-rich to calcareous clays? And what does this mean?
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about this a lot. So the one thing to say, I was very nervous about running over, so I cut out a lot of things, hoping that people would ask questions. But the shale is really located quite high in the mountains. I actually remember when we took a trip from Kuba up to the Cedars, and that's where, and then I saw an outcrop of this shale, and it's, you have to drive 45 minutes, up the mountain. So it's not really located next to these sites. And so that's why we've developed this idea that perhaps some of this production was itinerant, because you really have to explain how they're getting this stuff, which is quite far from the sites. And then the idea being that they could powder it and bring it down. However, I think that's bound up in a system of a sort of symbiosis between moving into the mountains with your livestock and in this population coming down, and perhaps potting on the coast seasonally and that sort of thing. And when that system is no longer reliable, they have to come up with a way of producing those vessels locally. And I have to say that we've done experiments on the calcareous wares and the shale wares as part of this experimental system of potting. And if you fire the calcareous wares anything near 800, they just crumble. And whereas the shale wares can be really highly fired without any fear. And actually, the quality of the vessels made of the shale is much higher. They're much nicer vessels, I would say, overall.
One more question from Elisabetta Buareto. What kind of archaeological data you would look for to resolve the invisible people? She refers to your last slide.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think we would. I mean, I assume that what we have a problem with is actually, fourfold in Lebanon. I think really we've got, the problem of urbanization, destroying sites before we find them. It's thick. It's very difficult to see. There's a lot of vegetation. So I'm not sure that we can really resolve it. I mean, if there are people living in small sites and they're not using pottery a large amount, we may not see them. So, and then what does that leave? Probably stone tools. And, those I think are poorly defined for the period really. And we may just say, okay, they're broadly Chalcolithic or Neolithic or something like that. So I think we need a focused program of analysis to try to discover these sites. The other thing to say also is that, we don't really know what's going on in the mountains. So and then we know that there are sites up there. Some of them, one has been excavated, to some degree. So I think as we move into surveys in the mountains, we may find more sites. But ask anyone who's surveyed in Lebanon. I mean, it's quite difficult. I imagine you run into these problems all across the Levant, where you have thickly forested regions and a lot of vegetation. It's just hard to see small sites.
Mm-hmm.
LiDAR?
One more question while we wait for our next speaker. Actually, we have time for more than one question. If anyone else has something to ask, then this is the time. Just to make sure I understand. So there was a change in settlement with the decline of the Combed-Ware during the EB3, correct? I mean, did you mean that the disappearance of Cuba 1 was related to the decline of this industry?
So the metallic, the sort of shale industry declines eventually between the EB2 and 3 transition. Cuba 1 just shifts position. It doesn't go away. Cuba 1 is located 300-400 meters from Cuba 2. It's just that
Okay.
that site is not, it's not really occupied. I mean, we only have pits there. We don't actually have a settlement, you know, so it's not really an occupation that we can, as far as we can tell. So it's just that the site moves slightly, you know, so it's the sites, the abandonment of most of the sites, or let's say a large reduction in settlement, takes place between EB3 and EB4. And that's when the Combed-Ware appears. Yeah, so most of the sites, but I would say that most of the sites that are occupied in the EB3, the secondary sites that we know of, really get going after 2900. So while there's this initial appearance of this EB2 tradition, it doesn't seem like it's widespread until about 2900. So it's slow to take off, really, even though it appears suddenly. Ask me in 2 years, I'll probably have a completely different interpretation, you know, once we get more data. But at least in terms of the coastal strip of Lebanon, you know, we feel like pretty much all the information we have is present, you know, but.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamal. And I think we have some technical issues with our next presentation. So we will have to pause the session for a couple of minutes until we